Chapter 1. Dr. Joseph Warren. Act worthy of yourselves. He was not in the healing business today. No, thought Dr. Joseph Warren as he stared at the musket gripped in his hands, I am not here to heal men today. It was June 17th, 1775, a hot, sticky day. Peering over the redoubt at the summit of Breed's Hill, just outside of Boston, Warren saw line after line of British soldiers forming at the base of the gently sloping hill. It was clear that they had one objective in mind, to push the American militia off the heights that dominated the city of Boston and its harbor. Still feverish from illness and battling a severe headache, Warren slumped against the dirt wall the men around him had built during the night. Only hours before, he had borrowed a musket from his friend James Brickett and walked from Cambridge to Breed's Hill. Arriving at the scene of the coming conflict, he saw the acting American commander, General Israel Putnam, surrounded by his officers. "What orders do you have for us, General?" Putnam asked, referring to Warren's recent commission from the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. "I am only here as a volunteer," Warren replied. "I know nothing of your dispositions, nor will I interfere with them. Tell me where I can be most useful." "At the redoubt," Putnam replied, pointing to the top of Breed's Hill, where a wall of freshly dug dirt made a barrier for the militia to fight behind. "There you will be covered." Warren smiled. He had come to fight, not be safe. "Tell me where the onset will be most furious." "The redoubt," Putnam replied again. With a handshake, Warren left Putnam behind, striding up the hill toward the American line of defense. As he approached, one of the men behind it exclaimed, "It's Dr. Warren!" Cheers rose from the gathered men. Moments after arriving, Colonel William Prescott, the commander of the militia atop Breed's Hill, appeared at Warren's side. "Does the general have any orders?" Warren smiled again. "I am not here to take command. I have not yet received my commission. I have come as a volunteer with my musket to serve under you. I shall be happy to learn from a soldier of your experience." Prescott, a grizzled New Englander of few words, nodded at the tall, blond doctor and moved on. Warren thought he had seen the hint of a smile play on Prescott's lips as he glanced at Warren's silk shirt and jacket. Having come directly from a meeting of the Provincial Congress in Cambridge, Warren had had no time to change. Now, as he leaned against the cool soil of the dirt wall, Warren turned his head around to see Prescott atop it, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes, looking down the hill. And then, with a thunderous crash, the British ships in the harbor began to bombard Breed's Hill. "Here they come, boys!" Prescott shouted as he leapt down from the redoubt. The skirmishes at Lexington and Concord on April 19th had been only the beginning. It was clear now that if the colonies wanted independence, they were going to have to fight for it against the greatest army in the world. Warren pushed himself to his feet and glanced down the line of defenses. At best, the men with him were poorly armed, untrained, and inexperienced in the art of war, and they had little ammunition. Below Warren and the defenders of Breed's Hill lay Charlestown. He watched as the left flank of the British attack hit the small town. The American defenders there put up a spirited fight, but a short while later, flames began licking hungrily at the dry timber of the closely built houses. Now both flanks of the British attack were directed at the defenders atop Breed's Hill. A few men began firing prematurely. "Save your ammunition!" Prescott's voice boomed along the line. He was again atop the redoubt, this time conversing with a fellow officer whom Warren did not know. Calmly, as if taking a Sunday stroll, the two walked and talked, seemingly oblivious to the British cannonballs and the American cheers. Their courage steadied the strained nerves of the inexperienced American militia. "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes," Prescott yelled. "We will make every shot count." Another voice cried out, "Shoot the officers first." Warren watched the distant lines of British regulars draw closer, their red coats blazing, their white trousers moving in mesmerizing unison. He heard the sounds of the fife and drum as the British musicians played a merry tune. He heard the shouted commands of the British officers and felt his knuckles whiten as he gripped his musket even tighter. This is why he had come. This is what he had lived for, and if this struggle for independence could not be settled by peaceful means, then he was prepared for war. The words of the speech he had delivered so many years ago echoed in his mind. May the Almighty Being graciously preside in all our councils. May He direct us to such measures as He Himself shall approve and be pleased to bless. May we ever be a people favored of God. May our land be a land of liberty, the seat of virtue, the asylum of the oppressed, a name and a praise in the whole earth, until the last shock of time shall bury the empires of the world in one common, undistinguished ruin. "Ready!" Prescott yelled. Warren and the men around him rose as one, their muskets flying to their shoulders. Staring down the smooth musket barrel, Warren watched as the British troops drew nearer. Visions of his deceased wife and his young children flashed through his mind. 50 yards, 40 yards, and still no command from Prescott. "Awake, awake, my countrymen, and by regular and legal opposition defeat the designs of those who would enslave us and our posterity." Warren's breath whistled through his clenched teeth. The British were 30 yards away now. Warren could see their eyes, their grim faces, the sun gleaming on their bayonets. He heard Prescott yell, "Fire, boys!" With a roar of voices and the pop, pop, pop of musket fire, the British troops disappeared behind a cloud of black gunpowder smoke. It was late September of 1765, and the light shining in the window indicated that the doctor was awake. In the quiet recess of his study, Joseph Warren sat staring at the parchment on his desk, the ink from the quill in his hand dripping dark blotches on the white paper. The events that would forever change his life and set in motion a political career that would eventually lead him to Breed's Hill 10 years in the future were just unfolding. As a young doctor, he was successful. During the smallpox epidemic the year before, he and a handful of other doctors had used inoculations, progressive medicine for his day, to curb the dreaded disease. Now, as his reputation grew, so did his practice. Warren listed among his patients Thomas Hutchinson, the Lieutenant Governor of Massachusetts, John Hancock, and other leading citizens of Boston. His favorites were John and Abigail Adams. In future years he would deliver their children. But it was not his medical practice that kept him awake late this night while his young wife Elizabeth slept. It was a political matter, the Stamp Act passed only months before by the British Parliament. Sponsored by George Grenville, the Stamp Act was the first direct tax imposed by Britain on its American colonies. Levied on the colonies to help defray the cost of maintaining troops in America, the new act taxed legal and commercial documents, as well as newspapers, brochures, and paper, all of which had to carry a special stamp. The colonists reacted violently to the act. Lawyers and printers refused to use the stamps or stamped paper. In New York, a mob of angry colonists destroyed the house of a British officer who had threatened to cram the stamps down American throats at the point of his sword. Whispers of "no taxation without representation" began to circulate through the colonies. It was the Stamp Act that began to spark in the mind of Joseph Warren the concept of self-rule. As he sat staring at the parchment, the words he wished to write for the Boston Gazette began to flow. "Start, oh start from your trance," he whispered intensely to his unseen audience, his quill scratching feverishly across the parchment. Warren leaned back in his chair for a moment and stared out the window into the dark night. Then he began again, the words pouring from his heart onto the parchment. "By the unconquerable spirit of the ancient Britons, by the genius of that Constitution which abhors every species of vassalage, by the august title of Englishmen, by the grand prerogatives of the human nature, the lovely image of the infinite Deity, and what is more than all, by the liberty wherewith Christ has made you free, I exhort you to instruct your representatives against promoting by any ways or means whatsoever the operation of this grievous and burdensome law." When he finished, Warren quickly read the letter, dusting it with sand to dry the ink. Folding it, he carefully put it in his pocket and walked out the door to the printers. 1 week later, his letter appeared in the Boston Gazette, and Warren's words quickly moved him into the realm of politics. In the midst of a city just beginning to be torn by political strife, battle lines were being drawn. The group soon to be dubbed the Sons of Liberty, headed by Samuel Adams and fighting for American sovereignty, quickly recruited the bright young doctor to its side. Though the Stamp Act was repealed within the year, the intensity of the political struggle between England and her American colonies escalated with the Townshend Revenue Acts of 1767. Designed to assert imperial authority in the colonies, the acts imposed duties on paper, glass, and tea, created a board of customs, and authorized the use of blank search warrants called writs of assistance. As they did with the Stamp Act, the colonists reacted violently. There were petitions, riots, boycotts of taxed goods, and even the tar and feathering of custom officials. The rejection of this parliamentary taxation by the colonists was not tolerated by the British government. On October 1, 1768, a fleet of British men of war appeared in Boston Harbor, guns loaded, prepared for action. Aboard the ships were 2 full regiments, the 14th and the 29th, as well as a portion of the 59th. With drums rolling and fifes blaring, the British soldiers marched brazenly through the midst of Boston and bivouacked on the Boston Commons. In March of 1769, Warren was a member of the committee that adopted a petition to George III requesting the removal of these troops. The petition expressed sincere loyalty to the Crown, yet decried the unconstitutional use of troops against citizens of the Crown. It was met with silence, and all the while tensions mounted in the city of Boston until the night of March 5, 1770. At 8 p.m. on that day, the insults that had been traded all day long between British soldiers and some young men of Boston escalated into a fight. A barber's apprentice named Edward Garrick shouted an insult at the British sentry standing guard in front of the customs house. For the young apprentice's pains, the British sentinel on guard of the barracks knocked him down with the butt of his musket. A young unnamed boy quickly rang the warning bell at the old brick meeting house, and shots were fired as the civilians drove the soldiers back into their barracks. Things might have ended there were it not for a late arriving party of Bostonians. Having heard the ringing of the warning bell, they had rushed to the scene of the earlier fight. "There he is!" cried Edward Garrick. "That's the soldier who knocked me down with the butt end of his musket." The crowd began reassembling. Someone in the crowd yelled, "Kill him! Knock him down!" Objects were hurled at the sentinel, who loaded his gun and cried out for help. Reinforcements came in the form of an officer, a sergeant, and 7 soldiers. Soon the officer of the day, Captain John Preston, joined his men, who were roughly pushing the crowd away from the sentry box. Snowballs with rocks in them were then hurled at the soldiers, who began using their bayonets to push the crowd back. Then, in the cacophony of sound, a musket discharged, and then another, until all the soldiers had fired. In the stunned silence, the Bostonians retreated a short distance as the soldiers began reloading. 5 men were dead and 6 wounded, the snow stained with their blood. Captain Preston rushed among his men, stopping their efforts to fire again. The mob in front of them was growing, preparing to rush them once more. But as it did, drums rolled, and several companies of the 29th appeared, the front line of them kneeling, ready to fire. In moments, thousands of Bostonians gathered, having heard the news that the British soldiers had begun killing their fellow citizens. Thomas Hutchinson, now governor of Massachusetts, rushed to the scene and pleaded with the people to refrain from any further violence. After a short consultation with the officers in command, the troops were ordered back to their barracks, and the crowd began to disperse.